In this video, we're going to talk about Byzantine fault tolerance, or how do you design and build a distributed system that can survive the worst possible failures in your system. So if you recall, in the last video, we tried to classify all failures, and we came up with two big buckets. Fail-stop behavior is when, if you get a failure in your system, it leads to part of your system stopping. And when that node fails, you can either restart the node or fail over to one of the redundant nodes you happen to have running in your system. And then we said, oh, and there's all the other types of failures, which are Byzantine failures, a vast landscape of possible things that could go wrong that don't lead to fail-stop behavior. So not fail-stop, that's a useful mental definition of Byzantine behavior, but it's not so useful for mathematical proofs. So when we're more formally defining Byzantine behavior, what we really like to say is that some node in your system which is exhibiting Byzantine failure is a traitor node, and that traitor sends conflicting messages. It sends one answer to one of its peers and another different answer to a different peer. And this leads to an incorrect result of your calculation that your distributed system is trying to perform. So this may be caused by something as simple as a flaky node in your system. If one of the nodes in your system occasionally generates a null response when it runs out of memory or some other resource, that could lead to a Byzantine failure if your system wasn't expecting that to happen. On the other hand, if one of your nodes was attacked by a hacker, or just maybe owned by a hacker, who then tries to come up with the exact combination of messages to send to its peers to cause the entire distributed system to compute the wrong answer, that's also a Byzantine fault and a Byzantine failure, and we want to learn how to design systems that can tolerate these failures. So, why would you study Byzantine failure? This sounds like it's really hard to design a computer that can survive even a malicious actor taking over part of your computer. Well, you might need to do it for the application which you're building. Bitcoin is an example of that. We don't trust everyone who uses Bitcoin, and so everyone who's using Bitcoin, we don't want to trust them, and so if one of those nodes is a malicious actor, we don't want them to be able to take down the entire Bitcoin network. That would be bad news. You also don't want them to be able to collect all the money for themselves. That'd be good news for the hacker, not so good news for everyone else. Another example is if you need extreme reliability. The flight control systems are fly-by-wire in the Boeing 777 and 787, and because they're very worried about the reliability of these systems and that a hardware failure might exhibit Byzantine-like behaviors, they have built a Byzantine fault-tolerant flight control system into these aircraft. But most people aren't solving problems in that category. So what's the other reason why people study Byzantine failure? Well, they study it because solving this problem is fun. It's a lot of fun to try and figure out, how can I build something that will solve the worst possible case of a computer failing? And this reason has driven a huge amount of research since at least the early 1980s. The paper which we're going to be talking about later, the Byzantine generals problem, was written in 1982. And this is ongoing research to this very day. So you want to build a distributed system that has Byzantine fault tolerance. What assumptions are you making about your system and how your adversary can attack it? Are you assuming that your adversary can see all of the messages between your nodes because, for example, you might be using Wi-Fi and all your nodes are in close proximity? Or are you assuming that you have a switched Ethernet network and so all your messages are private, assuming the network itself doesn't get attacked? Are you assuming that your nodes might be able to fail and become corrupted by your adversary? Or maybe they can attack the network itself? Are you assuming that your adversary has limited resources? They can't, for example, attack your crypto and reverse engineer your cryptography keys. Or maybe they have access to very large compute clusters, and they can. Are you assuming that your adversary has to pick a strategy, write a program that implements that strategy, deploy it, and then attack your system with that, a static adversary? Or are you assuming that they can dynamically adjust to whatever it is you're doing to defend yourself and attack you in different ways? Are you assuming that the communication time between any two of your nodes is bounded or unbounded? If it's bounded, you can use timeouts to figure out when messages get lost. Are you assuming that your network is fully connected? Or maybe you have a system where some messages need to be relayed through other nodes. And the relay nodes, if attacked, might be a particular vulnerability in your system. Are you assuming that you or your opponent are allowed to use randomized algorithms, which changes the kind of proofs you might be able to come up with about what's possible and what's not? And also, are you assuming that your adversary is using a binary computer like you are, or maybe they've got access to some newfangled quantum computer technology, which will also throw some of your cryptography assumptions out of the window? These are all a bunch of assumptions. Let's move on and zero in on a specific set of assumptions and a specific problem so we can start to really understand how you design a Byzantine fault-tolerant system. Let's talk about the two generals problem, which is a fairly simple problem to let us learn how to reason about a Byzantine opponent. The two generals problem is an example of a consensus problem. And a consensus problem is where two nodes in our distributed system simply have to agree. And so in this problem, we've got two armies, Army A and Army B, and they're each led by a general, and they need to agree on one fact, which is, are we going to attack Army C in the morning, or are we going to sit on our hands and retreat? If both armies A and B do attack tomorrow morning, then they're going to win. If neither army attacks tomorrow morning, then they'll survive to fight another day. But if only one of armies A or B attacks tomorrow morning, they're going to lose because Army C is bigger than each of the two individual armies A and B. So there's only one wrinkle to this, which is the generals of armies A and B can only communicate through couriers. And these couriers ride horses through the territory of Army C. So they may or may not make it to the opposing general. So we need to come up with a protocol. What messages should the generals send between each other so that they're in consensus and they can agree to attack tomorrow morning or not attack tomorrow morning? And to simplify the problem, let's assume that General A decides they want to attack tomorrow morning and they want to simply tell General B, yes, we're going to attack tomorrow morning, and be sure that General B got the message. What series of messages might you send between A and B in order to make sure that they're always in consensus about what they do tomorrow morning? I'm going to ask that you pause the video right now, pull out a piece of paper, and come up with a protocol that achieves this. Welcome back. So when I looked at this problem, I thought it seemed sort of like TCP/IP, which starts with a three-way exchange, SYN, SYN-ACK, and then ACK. And I said, can't we just use the same solution for the two generals problem? And so I sketched on a piece of paper a protocol that looks sort of like that, which is if General A decides they want to attack, they send a message to General B saying, if you respond, I'll attack. Now, if this message gets lost, no problem, because A is not going to attack unless they get a response. Great. B gets this message and says, okay, I now know that A is going to attack tomorrow morning if I respond, and I'm going to respond, so good. So A will attack, I want to attack, I'll send a message back saying, if you respond, I'll attack too. If that message is lost, no problem once again, because B hasn't committed to attack, and neither has A yet. A receives the second message, and when it gets the second message, it is now committed to attack because it sent out its challenge and got its response. Then A responds with, okay, I know I'm going to attack for sure. B, you should attack for sure as well. But there's a problem here, which is if this third message is lost, A is committed to attack and B is not yet committed. So we haven't solved the problem. Maybe we can add another message to the end of this protocol. The problem is, no matter what message we come up with, and no matter how many messages we add to this protocol, there's always going to be the problem of you have an inconsistent state until that one last message gets through. You can actually prove that there's no way of solving the two generals problem, as I've stated it, which is kind of unfortunate. There is no perfect solution to this. So this is a situation where our network is our Byzantine opponent. It is, you could see this as our network is the node that's been corrupted by a traitor. And so how do you work around the two generals problem in practice? In practice, you assume that your enemy isn't perfectly Byzantine. Maybe it's statistically going to lose messages as opposed to always going to do the worst possible thing to you. And if you make that assumption, you can come up with a protocol like, okay, if General A wants to attack, they send 100 couriers to General B, all saying, we're going to attack tomorrow. And if any of them get through to B, B attacks. As long as one of our 100 couriers gets through, problem solved. Works well enough in most situations. So that's the two generals problem, which demonstrates that if your Byzantine failure results in the failure of your entire communication network, there's no way that you can get consensus between your nodes in your distributed system. But what if we flip that around? What if the individual nodes in your system are what can get corrupted, and we assume that the network works? Well, in that case, we have what's called the Byzantine generals problem. Now, the Byzantine generals problem is a paper, a seminal paper in computer science in distributed systems that was published in 1982 by Leslie Lamport, Robert Shostak, and Marshall Peace. And it answers a whole bunch of questions and a whole bunch of scenarios and sets of assumptions. And in particular, it answers questions of how many Byzantine node failures can a distributed system survive and still generate the correct answer. And also it tells you one way of building such a system. It doesn't answer the question of whether it's worth doing. As I mentioned before, it's kind of hard to build a Byzantine fault-tolerant system, and it's up to you to decide whether your application requires the work. What is the Byzantine generals problem? Well, once again, it's a story about some generals who are trying to attack an enemy. In this case, you have a number of Byzantine generals that are leading armies trying to attack a fortress. And I've got Byzantine generals here because of the wonders of internet clip art, but pretend they're Byzantine and not Byzantine, please. So here I'm showing we have 5 Byzantine generals trying to attack a fortress. And they need to decide, what are we going to do tomorrow morning? Are we going to attack or are they going to retreat? And so each of them, in their own brain, decides what it is they want to do. And then they talk to all the other generals and say, here's what my vote is. Here's what I think we should do tomorrow morning. And so in this case, the votes that the generals come up with are attack, retreat, retreat, attack, attack. So 3 attacks, 2 retreats. If the majority wins, they're going to attack tomorrow morning. And all of them know what all of the other generals' votes are, so they can just look at the majority value and all do exactly the same thing together. Doing the same thing together, that is consensus. And that is the goal of this problem, is to make sure that all of the generals are in consensus. What if one of our generals is a traitor? That traitor's mission now is to mess with the consensus and make it so that the other generals don't agree on what they're going to do tomorrow morning. We don't care about what the traitor is thinking internally because they're a traitor. They can think whatever they want. They're thinking evil thoughts. But we do care about what the other generals think the traitor said and that they all agree on what the traitor said. In this case I've shown they currently all think the traitor said attack. Or it would be just as valid if they all thought that the traitor said retreat, because they'd still be in consensus and they would all do the same thing. It would be bad news if half of the loyal generals thought that the traitor said attack and half of them thought he said retreat, because then they'd do different things. And the traitor would be happy because they'd be successful in their mission to corrupt the consensus of the other generals. When we study the Byzantine generals problem, what I've just described is a superset of the problem, which is the problem of getting all of the generals to agree on what to do tomorrow morning. The Byzantine generals problem, in particular, is the problem of communicating one decision from one general to all the other generals. So the Byzantine generals problem is solving one element of this vector, which I've shown next to each of the generals. So Byzantine generals problem subscript 1 would be all of the loyal generals in the system have to agree on what the first general wants to have happen, either attack or retreat, and they have to be consensus on that fact. We don't care about what the traitorous generals think, but as long as all the loyal generals agree, we've solved the problem. So that's the Byzantine generals' problem. We're simply trying to get the loyal generals to agree, come to consensus on a single fact. So you might ask yourself, how many traitors can we possibly deal with and have them lie to all their peers and still have the remaining loyal generals come to agreement? Can we tolerate a single traitor of our 5 generals? How about 2 and have the remaining 3 generals agree? How about 3 traitors? Can 3 traitors mess up the decision of the remaining 2 generals? And if you have 4 traitors, well, the 1 general that's left will obviously agree with themselves. There's no consensus to be achieved. So let's figure that out. Let's start off by dismissing the trivial cases. If you only have 1 general, there is no consensus problem. They agree with themselves, or they're a traitor, and we don't care. Same with 2 generals. If they agree with each other, great. If one of them is a traitor, there's no consensus to be had. So let's move on to the case of 3 generals. Can we get them to agree on what's said? And let's label clearly who's doing what. The general who has the order and is trying to communicate it to its peers, we're going to call them the commander. And then the 2 remaining generals who are listening to that order and trying to agree upon what was said, we're going to call those the lieutenants. So in this case, the commander might say, attack, and he'll say attack to both of the lieutenants. If you're the lieutenant in the bottom left, you might say, well, I heard him say attack, but I want to make sure that's what he told everyone. So you'd ask your peer lieutenant, hey, did he say, what did he say? And your peer might say, oh, he said attack. And so at that point, you'll have heard attack from the commander, you'll have heard attack from the other lieutenant, and you'll say to yourself, great, we're going to attack because we're all in agreement, we're in consensus. But what if one of these 3 was a traitor? And let's assume it's not yourself. If your peer lieutenant was the traitor, it might flip the order such that what you hear now is, I heard attack from the commander, but my peer lieutenant said the commander said retreat. Now I'm not sure what to do. Well, let's think about all the cases and see if I can still figure out what to do. What's the other possible case? The other possible case is that the commander was a traitor and told the 2 lieutenants 2 different orders, and told me attack and told the other lieutenant retreat. At which point I would have heard attack from my commander, and I would have heard retreat from my peer, and crud. I can't tell those 2 cases apart because I'm getting the same 2 messages no matter whether the commander is a traitor or whether my peer lieutenant is a traitor. And so I cannot decide whether I should attack or retreat. And this is true in general. There is no solution to the Byzantine generals problem if you have 3 generals and you assume that there's 1 traitor. There is no solution to the 3 generals, 1 traitor case. So that raises the question, how many generals do we need before we can tolerate a traitor? How many generals do we need before we can tolerate M traitors? Well, in the paper there's a lemma, and that lemma says that there's no solution for 3M plus 1 generals with greater than M traitors. Or phrased differently, if 1/3 of your generals are traitors, or more than 1/3 of your generals are traitors, you're out of luck. There's no solution to this problem. Now, don't take my word for it. Let's go through the proof that proves that this is actually true. And the way the proof works is like this. Step 1, you assume that you have some solution to the Byzantine generals problem where 1/3 or more of your generals are traitors. For some number of generals, let's pick some arbitrary values, like you have 12 generals and 4 traitors and you think you've solved the problem. Okay, well on the next slide I'm going to show you how you can use that solution to solve the 1 traitor, 3 generals case. And if you can do that, well, we've just demonstrated that it's impossible to solve the 1 traitor, 3 generals case, so your assumed solution must be wrong. There is no such solution for if you have 1/3 or more of your generals are traitors. Okay, so that's the proof, but I told you I was going to explain how we use any particular assumed solution in order to solve the 1 traitor, 3 generals case. And it goes like this. Well, we have 3 generals. And each of these generals pretends to be 4 generals by running a simulation. Maybe they're running a simulated general on a little virtual machine on their computer. Each of those simulated generals runs the assumed solution amongst themselves. So now we have 12 simulated generals all talking to each other, all trying to come consensus on what the order is given by the simulated commander. The simulations that belong to the loyal generals will execute correctly, and they'll come to consensus. The simulations that belong to the traitorous general, they'll do the worst thing possible, they'll be traitors themselves, but since we assumed we solved the problem, they'll get ignored. And as a result, all of our loyal simulated generals will agree with each other. And then the loyal generals can just read the results of their simulations and follow that order. Great! So that means that no matter how many generals we have, if we solve the Byzantine generals problem, we can use that for 1/3 or more of our generals being traitors. We can use that solution to solve the 3 generals, 1 traitor case, which we know can't be solved. And hence, our lemma is actually true. There is no solution for 3m plus 1 generals if greater than m of your generals are traitors. So far, we've learned what the Byzantine generals problem is, and we've also learned that we can't possibly solve it if 1/3 or more of our generals are traitors. So let's assume that we don't have that many traitors. Less than 1/3 of our generals are traitors. And we're still assuming that we're trying to solve this with oral messages and crypto. Can we solve this problem? Can we come up with an algorithm that works? Well, we're going to do that here. We're going to call this algorithm the oral messages algorithm, or OM. And its parameter m says how many traitors we're going to tolerate. Less than or equal to m traitors. Great. So we're going to solve this inductively. So let's come up with a solution for how do we do this if we have 0 traitors. The base case of 0 traitors works like this. The commander sends out their order, and then the lieutenants, they follow the order. Great. That's fairly simple base case. What happens if m is greater than 0, if there's 1 or more traitors? Well, the algorithm works like this. The commander sends the order to all the lieutenants. Each of the lieutenants records the order they received. Then they use the same algorithm, the oral messages algorithm, for m minus 1 to tell all of the other lieutenants what they heard from their commander. Once that message is been communicated between all of them, each of the lieutenants has a vector, which is a vector of what they think every lieutenant heard from the commander. They then take the majority value of that vector as the order which they follow. So in the case shown here, all the lieutenants heard attack. All of them told their peers, I heard attack. And so the majority of attack, attack, and attack is attack. And they all have consensus and they do the right thing. So that's the solution. How does it work out if they're traitors? Let's walk our way through this. If we have 1 traitor, and the traitor happens to be the commander will send conflicting orders to its lieutenants. So the lieutenants will hear, for example, attack, attack, retreat. The lieutenants will then tell each other what they heard, and each lieutenant will learn that the first lieutenant heard attack, the second lieutenant heard attack, and the third lieutenant heard retreat. The majority of attack, attack, retreat is attack, and they all come to consensus and come to the same conclusion that they should attack, in spite of the fact that their commander was trying to confuse them. What if one of the lieutenants is a traitor? Well, in that case, the commander will send the order attack to all 3 lieutenants, and the third lieutenant, we don't care what they heard, we don't care what they think, it just doesn't matter. But they're going to try and tell things to their peers to confuse them. So maybe they'll say attack, maybe they'll say retreat. We don't care, because in spite of what they say, the majority of the values in each of the other lieutenants' vectors will be attack, which is the correct order, and the conclusion the loyal lieutenants will come to is attack. The algorithm works for m equals 1. M equals greater than 1, it's a little bit complicated because of all the recursive instantiations. It's hard to write down on a slide cleanly. But I encourage you to pull out a piece of paper and try and diagram this out of how do you deal with 2 traitors. And as a note, to deal with 2 traitors, you need at least 7 generals. So let's talk about how efficient that algorithm is, because I just showed it to you with recursive instantiations, and I didn't unfold it all if m equals greater than 1, and there's a reason for that. And it's because it's slow. You see, if m equals 0, it sends n messages, one message from the commander to every lieutenant. If m equals 1, we need to send n squared messages to get this algorithm to work. If m equals 2, we need to send n cubed messages. And if m equals 3, we need to send n to the 4th messages. That's a lot of messages. And so this is an expensive algorithm. Byzantine fault tolerance in general is an expensive thing to do. And so in the real world, what we tend to do is, first thing you do is if you're ever tempted to solve Byzantine fault tolerance or the Byzantine generals problem, think again. Do you really need to solve this problem? If you still think you need to solve it, try and use someone else's solution, because it's kind of complicated to get right, and your solution is likely to have bugs in its first implementation. And also, when you're trying to solve this, try and keep your values of n and m as small as possible so that it doesn't get too slow. So that's Byzantine fault tolerance. If you want to learn more about this, I encourage you to go and read the Byzantine Generals paper, which I've been talking about, and also read some of the follow-on papers. They're absolutely fascinating. They have more rigorous proofs. They have other scenarios and assumptions, like what do you do if you're allowed to use crypto? What do you do if your messages can't be communicated directly between every node? They come up with more efficient techniques to use in the real world. And they also have lots and lots of cool math if you're into that kind of stuff. So go and explore. Thank you.